It's a high-tech conversation
and a low-tech topic.
live on the World Wide Web via Zoom. Bench Talk 101.
Welcome everyone to Siggy's talk. He is our first speaker from Australia, and it's a pleasure to have him join us, waking up at stupid o'clock in the morning before he starts work to come and talk to us. So without further ado, over to you, Siggy.
Hey folks, can you see my screen?
Yep, all good.
Beautiful. Okay, so yeah, it's a bit of a privilege to be chatting to you folks today. It is Friday morning, 7:30 in the morning here, and yeah, the sun's sort of just come up, and it's still summertime. Hence, I'm wearing a t-shirt. This is actually the t-shirt that I slept in because I woke up specifically for this talk. Anyway, so I am just going to do a bit of a PowerPoint here. Feel free to stop me along the way or at the end when we have some questions to ask me anything you want, because there's a lot of things that we do differently in Australia than what a lot of folks do overseas, whether that be timbers, tools that we may use to with those timbers, and just the mindset tends to be a little bit different out here because we're so far away from the rest of the world. But yeah, let's get stuck into it. So if you can see my screen, I've got this little PowerPoint thing here. So that's my name, Siegfried Chaloupka. It's a bit of a foreign sounding name, but I'll get into that later. And I believe that my journey is perhaps slightly different even to those in Australia. So we'll go into that. And you can see there in the background is a burl, or a burr if you're in the UK. That's from the musk tree, which is a tree that you really only find here on an island off the coast of Australia called Tasmania. If you're into cricket, that's where Ricky Ponting is from. If you're not into cricket, then you're stuffed, sorry. But anyway, that piece of burl was cut down by a friend of mine, and I have it actually right beside me if you want to see it later on, and it's quite a unique, fascinating timber. So I thought that was quite symbolic of Australia, and I should have it there as my my cover page, I guess. Oops. All right, next slide. So who am I? So that's me, the one on the right, the darker one. I'm 34 years old. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. Now, if you haven't been to Australia, that's we've got two big cities in Australia, which you could probably think of like Los Angeles and New York in the States. And we've got a bit of a rivalry as well, except it's not a rap rivalry. It tends to be more so centered around sport. So Melbourne is the southernmost large city on the mainland. It's the capital of a state called Victoria, which is different from Victorian Canada. Anyway, my main job by day is being an engineer, basically. So I was trained at university as a mechanical engineer. And so this woodworking sort of business is not my day-to-day thing. It's purely a recreational thing that I do in the evenings, and I guess the quality of my work really reflects that, because I don't, I'm not doing 10 or 12 hours a day on the tools. And I was very lucky to find that lady in the red dress there, Jansen. She's my missus, and she's very tolerant to it all. She doesn't mind me reading woodworking magazines in bed and things like that, because yeah, she's kind of got a family who are very much into the arts and stuff like that. So that's who I am today. But where I started, well, I've got a bit of a tan. So a lot of people have wondered, you've got such a, a Germanic name. How come you're only 5'5" and you're dark? You look like you could be from Malta or something. And that's because my dad's German and my mum's Indonesian. So my dad came out here in the 70s, in the early 70s, and my mum came out here in the late 70s. She came out to study economics and my dad, he came out basically to find work. He just wanted a break from Germany. And they met, and I was the first result, I guess you could say, of them. I do have a sister, a younger sister called Heidi, who also gets a lot of laughs because she's not blonde haired either, like most fairy tale stories of Heidi's are. But I was always encouraged to pursue creativity from a young age, even though I am an engineer and my mum, did economics. My dad always encouraged me to take up a musical instrument. So I actually played piano from a very young age. And I actually wanted to study piano. My original goal was to move to Russia, of all places, and study at the Moscow Conservatory. Either that or the St. Petersburg Conservatory. So I'm quite big into classical music, I guess you could call it. And I've got a big sort of soft spot for all the Russian Romantic composers. I did also play clarinet for about 7 years, but that was sort of a lesser pursued instrument. But then I stopped it all when I reached 19 and I finished high school because it had dominated my life so much that I just gave it up. So I was always encouraged to pursue creativity. Originally, when I finished high school, I wanted to work as a LAME, which is a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer. So I went to like a technical college, I guess you could say, where I learned fabrication and how jet engines are pulled apart and all that sort of stuff. But then a bunch of things happened. I ended up, after completing that qualification, which was two and a half years, because I had surgery halfway in between, I ended up working for a small mining company, helping them with fabricating containerized substations. So that was basically putting switchgear into 40-foot containers, and fabricating the whole lot and painting the whole lot and sending them off to remote places like Chile, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and I think we sent a couple off somewhere in China or something out that way. Probably about 3 years into that job, I left that because my boss there was essentially wanting to retire. So I ended up getting mad keen into the outdoors because of my dad's Germanic background. I ended up taking up mountaineering and climbing and got quite into it. I've got some photos later on that I'll show, but it doesn't really work to, it doesn't really weave give a little bit of insight into my mentality. I chose that pursuit because it was something that made me feel very sort of connected to nature. But it's also the sort of pursuit that you have to work quite hard towards for comparatively small gains. So typically if you go on a mountaineering trip, you'll plan a year in advance, and the trip might be for 2 to 3 weeks, but you'll spend all year getting your kit ready, getting your body ready, and studying what you want to climb. And quite often, once you get to the top, you really only spend about 5 or 10 minutes at the top, just getting your breath back before you have to abseil all the way back down. So I have a bit of a liking to be in an uncomfortable position, I guess you could say. That's just sort of, yeah, my mentality. Some people say, used to joke and call me the hurt machine because I like to just endure that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I was originally paid to work with metal before wood. So my mentality, especially because of that training that I had to become a LAME, was mainly from a precision type kind of thought process, and using materials that comparatively didn't really shrink or expand that much and were homogeneous, which means that no matter which way you cut them, a bar of steel will generally behave in the same way in all directions, which is not true with timber, as all of you would know. So I actually went back to university in 2012 to qualify as an engineer, like a degree qualified engineer in mechanical engineering. And when I was at university, which was for another 4 years, because I'd recognised prior learning, I actually specialised in composites, resins, prototyping and tooling manufacture. So long story short, it means that I was in love with playing around with carbon fibre, epoxy resins, and all the molds and stuff that you have to use in order to make those products, basically. So I've got quite a... I worked in that industry for about, as I studied part-time, because of my recognised prior learning, I was able to work in that industry at an almost full-time capacity. So for about 3 or 4 years. So I got quite well versed in using those materials. And also because that company was, it was essentially a startup, that we had to be extremely resourceful. So we came up with ways of producing high quality products. One of which, for example, was we used to make components, audio components for the world's most expensive record player manufacturer, Continuum Audio, who are in Melbourne. People like Nick Cage and all those Hollywood guys buy their stuff. And, you know, a tone arm, which is one of the pieces that we used to make, was about 20 grand, which I think in US bucks is like 14 grand, but that's still a lot of money. So, and the methods that we used to make those were very sort of makeshift, and if you looked at it, you think, how the hell could you make those products? But so I was trained from very early on to be as resourceful as possible and not to feel daunted by a lack of tools, basically. That photo there that you can see is actually myself at about 2 years of age. That's in the National Gallery of Victoria here in Melbourne, on my dad's workbench. And that's my mum holding my hand. And my dad had just been in Vienna and bought me back my first pair of lederhosen, which I'm wearing there, which I still have to this day, by the way. I can't fit into them anymore, but I have them in my cupboard. So, yeah. So my woodworking education, how did I learn about woodworking? Well, initially I was trained by my father, and later on in life, I was trained by a German gentleman called Frank Wiesner. So that there is me, again at the National Gallery a couple of years later, using and getting confused by a reversible dovetail saw with an offset handle, which if any of you have used them, you'd know how if you were to put one of those into the hands of a 3 or 4 year old, they get pretty confused. So I should talk to you a little bit about who those two people are. This is my dad in the middle, myself on the left and my sister on the right. This would be in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. Most likely just before school. So it's probably 8 o'clock in the morning. My sister's wearing her school uniform and I've got my school pants on, and we've probably just had breakfast. That was when my father made in his home workshop this rather ornate picture frame. It's all hand gilded, water gilded inserts and oil gilded ornamentation. All the ornamentation is made from something called compo, which it's not carved wood. It's essentially a medieval type of putty, I guess you could say. And it's all the molds for that were reverse carved by my father. He was trained to do that as part of his apprenticeship. So who is he? So his name's Peter, a rather average name considering my name, the name he gave me, and my sister's name. He's German. He was born in 1948, and he's what they call over there a Schreinermeister, which essentially translates to a joiner. But their whole system there is a little bit different. They sort of categorize things differently. And so he was what they called a Möbeltischler. Anton, I couldn't put the umlauts there on the O, so forgive me for that sort of grammatical spelling mistake there. But a Möbeltischler is someone who basically specializes in furniture joinery. So that's what he was originally trained in. He started his training when he was about 13 or 14. Both his parents had basically were out of his life. I guess you could say, and he was living in a men's hostel. And he qualified. He did, back then they had a compulsory journeyman year thing where he worked as a journeyman for, I think it was about 4 years before going back and becoming what they call a Schreinermeister, which is just the master joiner. So it's not a self-titled, it's not a self-given title. It's actually a qualification that they have. And the reason why a person is motivated to get that, and Anton's probably gone through this, is because a Meister means that you are officially allowed then to train apprentices and also to start your own business. So at least back in those days, if you were just a Gesellen or like a tradesman, you weren't recognized enough to be able to start your own thing. When he was 25, he got a little bit bored of Germany, just because of his family and all that sort of stuff. The dynamics there, and growing up in post-war Germany, it kind of left him wanting a little bit more. So he was going to go to Canada, actually. He had a friend out in Halifax who bought a fishing boat, and he wanted to go out there and do a bit of fishing. And also because he had a very, very soft spot for Americans. Despite his own father being part of what we all know as the SS, the Nazi army, he'd always had a soft spot for the Americans because there were a lot of American bases around where he grew up. And there were a lot of times where he was very hungry as a child, and American soldiers actually would feed him. He actually has quite a remarkable story where he got called in, and he was a skinny little kid, and there's this big, burly, handsome American chef at the army camp who called him in, and it was the middle of winter, and fed him. So yeah, so he had a soft spot for Americans, and he wanted to go to America, learn a little bit of English, and potentially move back to Germany to make furniture for the Americans who were living in Germany. One of his highlights, I guess you could say, due to the skills that he has, and I could do a whole talk on him, and I probably will in the future, is that he was extremely well versed with sort of the medieval methods of doing things, or the Renaissance sort of period ways of doing things. He was trained in wood carving, in gilding, in gesso work, in all those sort of old-fashioned ways. And also to be extremely resourceful with regards to getting the most out of every single tool that he has. And if he doesn't have a tool, to make his own tools. They're not always the prettiest looking things, but they certainly do the job. And I guess a testimony to that is the fact that he was employed at the National Gallery for 14 years, restoring furniture and producing frames as a one-man show. And when he finally left, they actually, what I heard was they replaced him with a team of people who at times could not keep up with the same sort of work rate that he had managed to maintain for quite a long period of time. So a highly skilled woodworker, and he's got very much a focus on, due to the industries that the areas of woodworking in which he worked, he has he doesn't admit it, but he's got quite a creative, artistic way of producing furniture. Like you would potentially think that he did some sort of study in fine arts, which he didn't, but that just came through osmosis from working in the gallery and various other places. So he really is a one-of-a-kind woodworker. So he was the one who sort of taught me all my basic skills growing up in the home workshop. He always maintained a fully equipped workshop at home, which he later ended up running his home business from when he finished at the National Gallery, in order to watch us grow up, because he wanted to be able to walk us to school in the morning with our German Shepherd, of course, and be home when we got home, which he couldn't do when he was working in the city because we were based about an hour outside of the city. My other mentor, who I more recently met, is a chap called Frank Wiesner. This guy is really amazing. Another German. He's 88 years old. He started his apprenticeship in Berlin when it was bombed out. He'd just been moved back in from Poland. He was evacuated with all the children of Berlin out to Poland, separated from his family, and brought back in. And he started his apprenticeship in 1948. No power tools because they had no electricity. And he came out here to Australia in the 50s, in the 1950s, and he settled up in Queensland, in Toowoomba, Queensland, which is it's over 1,000 miles north of where I am located. And it stretches like another 1,500 k's beyond that. It's a huge state that's just so vast. And coming from, a place like Europe, continental Europe, where things are relatively close to each other, that's what really captured Frank's mind and why he settled up there. Now, Frank, he works 6 days a week. He's a regimented guy, and he works full days at 88 years of age. And you wouldn't believe how the output that he has. And his focus is mainly on solid furniture with traditional joinery and based on a knowledge of wood technology. So his knowledge in using all sorts of joinery, expanding joints, sliding dovetails, all this sort of stuff in order to maintain stability is just beyond anyone else that I know of. There are perhaps people out there, but just because of the sheer amount of work and experience that he has, it's just absolutely insane. Now, he uses Australian timbers pretty much exclusively, unless he's really forced to not, basically. And all the timber that he has, he's actually cut down himself. He's cut it down since the 1960s into 5-inch slabs. He used to have mates in the forestry department up there, and they'd go out back or into the rainforests of Queensland, and they'd cut down all trees like red cedar, black bean from way up north in Queensland, all these timbers that most people haven't really heard of outside of Australia. So I would say that he potentially uses Australian timbers more so than any other maker here in Australia. I mean, there are people who may turn objects, pens and things like that, or make knife handles using all sorts of Australian timbers, but he's the one who's making full-size furniture using all the different timbers of Australia, which is quite phenomenal. Even his workbench, which you can see there, it looks like a European workbench, but it's made from an extremely rare timber called saturnine, which comes from Fraser Island, which is a tiny little island off the coast of Queensland, and it has a particular that particular tree that you can't find anywhere else in the world, and it's now protected and you can't harvest it. And here he is with his saturnine workbench. I've never even seen furniture made from that stuff. So so he really is, and in my dad's opinion, actually, my dad calls him the last Mohican, because when my dad was training at very sort of high-end traditional joineries in the 1960s, guys like Frank were sort of legendary at that point in time. And so when my dad met Frank and learned about Frank, it was like a blast from the past, sort of. He was this guy who sort of belonged 100 years ago with his ability to use hand tools and using a traditional old-fashioned workbench. He doesn't shun power tools. Frank is very much about power tools when it comes to doing the grunt work. There is no way in hell you're going to take a ripsaw and cut a piece of spotted gum or any sort of Australian hardwood by hand. You could do it, but I mean, you've got to be Arnold Schwarzenegger to do it, or just downright crazy. For example, we can't really use bimetal saw blades on our bandsaws because of silica content. We have to pretty much use tungsten tooling if possible, unless you enjoy sharpening your saws. So Frank, he's been my more recent sort of mentor, and despite the distance between us, I take my annual leave off every year to go up there and work with him. This is a photo when we were making some stools together. We were doing some bent laminations with some urea formaldehyde glue. and we were using a timber there called Sally Wattle, which is another very Australian timber. It's an acacia. And he is just a wonderful person, and calls me every week and emails me probably every second or third day, and is quite funny because he loves Johnny Cash, and despite being in Australia since the 1950s, he sounds like he's only been here for about 5 years because of his accent, and he doesn't understand half the time what Johnny Cash is singing about, but he sings along with it, which makes him awesome. Anyway, so where do I do my woodworking? Well, I've got a little workshop myself, which I'm sitting in right now. It wasn't always like this. The photo you can see on screen was actually during the COVID lockdown when I rebuilt my workshop with the help of my girlfriend's brother, who's in the photo there. He actually was over here from Texas. He lived at that time in Texas, running Pilates studios. He went over there as an oil and gas engineer. He worked, I forget what that, is it the energy corridor or whatever it's called in Houston, where they've got all the oil and gas companies, Chevron and BP and all of that. So he was there working, I believe, for BP, did his back end, thought, heck, I'm going to run some Pilates studios, and he got into that. So he came back because his visa was expiring, and we were locked down here in Australia, in Melbourne particularly, because we had the toughest restrictions in the world, and we weren't allowed out of our properties and things like that. So we ended up just coming up with the idea of knocking down the roof and 2 walls of the tiny garage at the back of a house and extending it out, not by much, just by 10 square meters, but it does make quite a bit of difference, and insulating it from the Australian summers, basically. So this is whilst we were rebuilding it. We're both working by day. He was running his studios during the day remotely, and I was working, from 8 in the morning till 5:30 in the evening with my clientele. As soon as we did this in winter, so the sun sets here at about 5:30. So we'd smash down some dinner, and then we'd head out under torchlights. So his sister or my partner would hold a torch for us, and we'd frame this up in the dark. That's what it looked like right before he arrived. That was my tiny space. As you can see, not a massive collection of woodworking tools. An old bandsaw, a carpenter's bandsaw from Germany, which I sold after about a week because it was just not ideal for woodworking, for fine woodworking. My little tool cabinet on the wall there with just a basic set of chisels, a basic set of hand planes. I didn't have a workbench at that point in time. I just had a welding table that I'd quickly knocked up with an old cast iron vise there that was, it was very much woodworking the way Bill Carter does his hand planes out of an engineer's vise like that, on top of a sheet of plywood, which I just clamped to the top of that welding table there. Behind it, you can see my pride of joy, my first real tool. That's my prized Prince of Austria, my Fronius TIG welder. Because during my career before I became a degree qualified engineer, I did quite a lot of fabrication work, as I mentioned earlier, in the mining industry and in tooling. So I had to be able to weld aluminium, some nickel-based alloys, some hex alloys, Inconel, as well as all the stainless steels and mild steel and braze things using silicon bronze and things like that. And next to it is a little Kempe MIG welder. So that always, and still does have pride of place in my workshop. It's still right next to my current workbench, looking a little bit dusty from the woodworking dust, but that's always been a part of my working life. And I'll never sell that machine because I love it so much, and it's just great. But this is the space that I worked in. At the back there, I had all this house stuff, and I didn't even have space to hang my clamps. So I used to hang these big fitters clamps off the beams, which were very low. I only had a single light globe in there. The light you can see in the photo was coming in through the garage doors, which was just a corrugated iron door. So in the summertime, when we had temperatures of over 40 degrees inside the garage, it was well over 50 degrees. There was zero insulation. The push bikes there were in the way. So eventually it came to a time where I needed a bigger space, and that's what it kind of looks like. That was this morning, actually, right after I watered the garden, before I started this talk. That's that little extension that I built on there. I've got plenty of photos of my workshop. I just don't want to bore you with them. Gone is the corrugated iron door. I built some insulated doors there from Australian hardwood there that you can see on the right-hand side. And I've got my little main entry door in the light grey there. And this is all just clad in hardy board, which is the practical choice in Australia, given our intense UV light and everything. And a colour bond roof, which is a traditional Australian way of doing it. And I've got double glazed windows that I put in. And most importantly, on the far left, you can see an air conditioner, which makes it bearable in the heat of summer. I think that's something anyone here in Australia really should have if possible. And my favourite thing actually is probably the little garden that I've planted around it. Very traditional Australian plants. I was always raised to be aware of the timber that I use in any projects. And so I've got in the same way that people in Europe have a soft spot for, say, French oak or a Tyrolean pine, if your name is Anton, or walnut if you're in the US, or maple in Canada. You've got a soft spot for those trees. You walk past them and you say, yeah, look at that beautiful oak tree. For someone like myself, I walk past a lemon-scented gum, a spotted gum, or a jarrah tree in the botanical gardens, or a banksia tree. Now, a banksia is like that bush you see at the front of the picture there with the flowers that look like toilet brushes. That's such an iconic type of tree that we have in Australia with so many variations, and they make you really feel quite relaxed and at home and put you in a good frame of mind, I guess you could say, which I think is very important. A good frame of mind when you want to produce good work. I always find that the amount of mistakes that I record if I'm in a happy state and not consuming substances that do that, generally the amount of mistakes that I make is far less than if I'm stressed or feeling a little bit down. So that's why I've cultivated this little garden. It's only about 10 months old. So that plant, that swamp banksia, which is right outside the window, hopefully that'll grow to the height of the window. So sort of 1.6 meters or so by the end of this summer, in the next couple of months. So we're looking on track for that. And this is my happy place, really. Like I said, I've only had this workshop since February last year, when I started the infrastructure inside the workshop, and I'm still due to get an electrician to come in to upgrade the circuit that I actually installed on my own out here with my girlfriend's brother, and to sign it off for insurance purposes and stuff. So it's still very much a work in progress. Before that, I was really just making do with what I had, because of that resourceful mentality. So I really tend to encourage people not to be put off by having minimal space or no space at all, to really form networks with people, meet other people who you can, utilize their workshop space, once a week or something like that, or their wood storage. I've got no wood storage. I have to store it at other people's places, including my dad's and Frank up in Queensland and a couple of other people's places. So I would encourage anyone not to feel put off, and also not to think that you can't undertake larger projects as well, because there are always ways around it. As my old man used to always say, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And that's something that I was always sort of brought up to, remind myself about. So some of you are wondering sort of what kind of stuff have you made? And I made all sorts of things, mainly to help my dad with his sort of stuff, because a lot of the stuff, was just a lot easier and a lot more economical if he enlisted some help, which used to be myself. This is actually the very first thing that I made for myself, or the very first thing I made in general that was bigger than a shoebox. It's a Roubo workbench. It was a bit, I was quite optimistic when I set out to make it. This was only in 2019. I didn't have a woodworking bench before that. I'd never built a woodworking bench before that. I never cut big dovetails like that before, or houndstooth dovetails, and I'd never worked with hard maple before in my life, or curly maple. So that's what it's made from. Why did I do it? I was a bit stupid. I fell for the online marketing of a wonderful manufacturer of bench hardware, who I can't fault. They make absolutely fantastic stuff. That's bench crafted. And at that point in time, it was the trendy sort of brand to have. And so I bought it. It was about $2,000 worth of hardware here in Australia. It's quite expensive. And I wanted to make a bench out of maple because that's what everyone on the internet was doing it from. I could have used Australian timbers. I could have obtained nicer timbers, in my opinion, for cheaper, but I just got sucked in. I don't regret it. I am using that bench right now. I'm talking from that bench. Yeah, it was just a learning experience, I guess you could say. That was when I finished it. I didn't have a workshop to build it in, so I machined the timber at my dad's workshop, and I cut the joinery there. Mind you, he was still using his workshop, so I had to clean up every time. But it took me about 4 months of out-of-hours work to do. I varnished it at my girlfriend's parents' place because they were in the Czech Republic on holidays for 3 months or 2 months, Czech Republic and Scotland, actually visiting family. And so the air was very still in their house, and I figured what better place than their lounge room to varnish the workbench. So again, yeah, that was me making use of other people's facilities. And it goes to show, if you clean up afterwards, people will let you use anything really, if you look after their tools and clean up afterwards. So that was the very first big thing that I've made. Most of my stuff has been, working around the house. This is before I really had the workshop set up or anything. I just work on the floor. That's me making a molding when we had to restore this fireplace that was completely destroyed. So yes, it's for a joiner, it's probably very straightforward. You can use a router table or routers to make all those moldings, or molding planes. I don't own any molding planes. I don't have a router table either. I've got a very basic old 1980s Inca table saw, a little one. But I basically made all these moldings, all these curves, all these profiles to match those in the house, using a number 7 Stanley plane, a number 4 Stanley plane, a shoulder plane, and a couple of radius blocks with sandpaper, and a couple of scratch stocks using an old cabinet scraper that I just cut up and filed to shape. Again, yeah, just to show that, if you want to do it, you can still do it. And my tools at that point in time were really just in that little tool tote that you can see at the back there near the bicycle. The reason why the bike was inside was because we were doing construction stuff around the house, and it got jammed in the lounge room there. So everything was quite ad hoc. But we got there, we got there, and I mean, all the tiling, I'd never done any tiling and all that, but and the rendering we had to, it's all, traditional, was it lime cement based rendering. So it was all challenging. I mean, we had a friend who specialized in historic stuff do most of that for us. But yeah, again, I want to encourage people who think that you need to have an outlay of thousands of dollars worth of stuff, that you don't need that. My shooting boards were literally from scrap, from packaging materials, old plywood. And yeah, I mean, as you can see, I didn't even have a workbench. I was working straight on the floor when I did that. So currently, I guess you could say one of the projects that people are interested in is my new workbench. So workbench number 2. The initial workbench that you saw me build was only 1.5 meters in length, because it was originally designed to fit in the old tiny little garage that was in here, which you could not back a car into. You could probably park like an Austin 7 in here or something. It was built in the 1930s and designed essentially for tiny little English cars of that vintage, basically. You could probably park a little Cooper Mini in here, just. But so that's why I built a small bench. I'd always felt uncomfortable using a Rubo bench, not saying it's bad or anything. It was just that I was trying to use traditional European cabinet makers workbenches, or hall, they call them hall bunks, or I think in Sweden they call them something like Kjövelbank or something like that. I'm sure Matthias can correct me there. That style of workbench with a shoulder vise, or like what Frank Klaus uses, is really what I learnt to use. And when I was last with Frank up in Queensland, it really hit at home that's actually what I feel comfortable the most on. So it is a full-size 2.2 meter long bench, or what's that, like a 7-foot bench if you use Imperial. And I did it the smarter way this time, using Australian timbers. Jarrah, which you can see there in the picture, that's my shoulder vise joinery, that front corner of a shoulder vise. Typically that's finger joints or a single large dovetail, but I employed some joint design of my own, I guess you could say. I came up with this, we sort of jokingly call it the zigtail out here in Australia, but I'd never seen that joint done before. But it combines the strength of finger joints with the self-locking properties of a dovetail joint, while still being kind of pretty. It looks a little bit like a trident in a way, being symmetrical and 3-pronged. What you can't see is that actually it goes the full 100 mil depth into that block, as you can see with that big major sort of dovetail at the front there. So there's quite a challenge, but I believe that when I do a project, especially for myself, and I'm not being paid for it, the only way to get better is to challenge yourself and to be slightly uncomfortable. So if making hand planes is your thing, trying out new combinations of dovetails, making the dovetail smaller, making a finer mouth, that might be your way of challenging yourself. And for me, it's coming up with new joint designs, combining my sort of mechanical engineering training and that sort of wood technology training that I was lucky to have from my father and from Frank, to come up with new sort of solutions, because that's sort of what drives me. So that's all cut from Jarrah, which is quite a hard timber. And as the workbench top, which you can sort of see blurred in the background there at the top right, I've used a timber called white mahogany, which is a eucalyptus acminoides, which is it's very dense. It's I think when it's dry, it's about 950 kilo per cubic meter. So it's essentially almost as dense as water, and extremely interlocked and hard. So it's stable. So that's why it was my prime candidate for a workbench. And it's all reclaimed timber as well, because I sourced all this timber during a lot of lockdowns, and it made no sense for me to go out and blow money on imported timbers, which have since gone up in price about 30% out here in Australia. So yeah, hopefully it's a bit of a one of a kind. It's built to last. I hope it certainly outlasts my family. I hope that in 200 years, someone finds it and ponders how to take it apart, because it's got quite a lot of complex joinery. That would be a pain in the ass if you wanted to break it down. But yeah, I could do a whole talk on that, and probably will on another day. And on that note, I've just realized I've run out of slides. So I think that pretty much concludes my talk. Having said that, there's so much that I could really talk about. There's Australian timbers, which I'm not sure how many people are interested in. And that's not just joinery timbers, but we've got, some rather exotic ornamental timbers suited for fine furniture, for veneering and tool making and things like that. I could also, talk about my sort of design influences when I build furniture. I'll leave that up to you guys if you want to ask me questions, because that's probably the best way to go about it. What do you reckon, Shrenik?
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, thank you very much, Siggy.
You're welcome.
Beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
So if anyone who hasn't joined before doesn't know how to ask Siggy a question, if you pop your name in the chat, I'll give you an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask Siggy yourself. So I think Paul jumped in very early on with a question for you. Over to you, Paul.
Hey, Siggy.
Hey.
Absolute fabulous talk. Thank you. Really interesting.
Thank you.
But I know that we spoke about some interesting timbers which you have, but what is your favorite timber?
Yeah, good question. So like most people, I started off going for the most highly figured timbers. That, you look at being a teenager and being into music. Often I'd find myself in a large music store and you'd see all those very expensive guitars and the work of some very high-end sort of luthiers. And you see all this, Hawaiian koa. When I first saw that, it blew my mind. I was like, what is this figuring on these, Taylor guitars? At the time, they were using a lot of koa. And so I started hunting for, all these burls, gidgee, which everyone knows of, mulga. But then I really got into European furniture. And one of my big influences actually is the 1930s furniture from the Cotswolds in the UK. The names have just slipped my mind. Then normally I speak about them. Is it Arthur Romney Green is my favorite British cabinet maker. And he uses a lot of oak, fumed oak. And what really became apparent to me was how to use something with a much milder figuring, but by the skill of the design and by the maker to really make it look, make a piece that really knocks you off your feet using something basic. And so my tastes in timber then became a lot more toned down, because you can always look, and Europeans can relate to this. You guys can always look at something made from oak any day of the week. You never get sick of it. You can have French oak floors. You can have oak cabinets. You can have oak this, that, whatever, and you never get sick of it. And in 100 years from now, it'll stand the test of time. It'll look just as good. Is that the same with, like highly figured gidgee or stuff like that? No, I personally, I look at something made from gidgee and I love it. And I understand the effort that goes into making something from it. But it's like a cup of tea with 10 spoons of sugar. Like you can't have that every day. You know what I mean? Whereas you can have a glass of milk, which is, it's not quite living on the edge, but you can have a glass of milk 4 times a day, provided you're not lactose intolerant. So my sort of favorite timbers now, let's say I like oak because of the furniture my dad had that was from oak, because he's very Germanic in that respect. Exotic woods, my favorite looking veneers are Brazilian rosewood veneers, not because of their rarity, but because of the history that they have, as well as teak, with furniture that was made in continental Europe, around Scandinavia and Germany in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. From Australian timbers, I really have a soft spot. My favorite timber is black bean, which you won't find now. No one's using it anymore because it's a known carcinogen, and it's a little bit like cocobolo with the dust, potentially even more so impacting. I'm asthmatic, and I can work with cocobolo, have worked with cocobolo, and whilst it does affect me a little bit, black bean, if I sand black bean, I literally have to step outside. It takes your breath away, basically, when you breathe the dust in. And so they don't use it anymore, but you can get a lot of furniture that was made in the 60s and 70s up in Queensland, which is way up north because it's a northern timber. It grows about 2,500 k's north of Melbourne. That's where it sort of thrives. That would basically be my favorite furniture timber. Yeah. And also hue and pine, I should say that. Hue and pine is a timber from Tasmania, way down south, one of the slowest growing timbers. I mean, there is a hue and pine tree that is still there that you can visit. That's over 10,000 years old. And typically hue and pine trees, to get to maturity, and I'm not a timber cutter, but from my knowledge of timbers, most of the timbers that they cut down from hue and pine trees was at least 800 years old, because it's that slow growing, and it has such a beautiful scent. It's a natural, that scent repels insects. So the colonials who lived down in Tasmania would often make cabinets and not finish the insides because of that scent. And it would actually act just the same way that mothballs work and deter insects. So they're probably my two favorite sort of timbers. Yeah.
Fabulously thorough answer.
Sorry,
Okay.
long-winded.
No, fantastic. Love it. Okay, I'll leave somebody else to ask another question. Thanks very much.
Yeah, go for it. No worries.
Thank you very much, Paul. Over to Matthias.
Hey, Matthias.
Hello, Siggy. Well, I will be the second to say what everyone will say. Absolutely blooming fascinating in so many ways. And what you were talking about, a lot of the stuff you were talking about resonated with me in a variety of ways. But let's get the first small bit out of the way. You were very, very close. Hyvelbänk.
Oh, man. Hyvelbänk?
Hyvelbänk.
Okay.
Yeah, it just means literally plain bench or planing bench.
Yep.
Yeah. And that was interesting because I grew up with that kind of bench. That's what we had in woodworking class, a school. That was what you found. If someone had a workbench for woodworking, it would be the classic Euro Scandi type of bench. And same as you, you can see it sort of behind me there. I built a Roubaud last year.
I see.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And same as you, I went for hard maple. And that is because I love the wood. And not because, here the obvious choice would have been beech. It would have been about half the price for the timber, but I just love maple. So that was me pleasing myself, not trying. And also I think you might be able to see it's all bench crafted.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful. That's beautiful.
But anyway, and what I found is this bench suits my way of working and my way of work holding much better than the traditional Euro Scandi bench did back in the day. It's weird. Because you were saying the opposite, that
yeah
exactly.
And I mean,
you
not
tried
say...
the new Robo, the American Roubaud, and it's left cold, or at least it's not hot enough.
I think, I mean, the workbench is so personal, right? Like neither is better. And if, in all honesty, if I stand back and from a non-biased perspective, probably the most good work, when you think about it, and going now and into the future, has been produced actually on the traditional cast iron record style vise.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Without a tail vise.
Yeah.
And so you cannot deny that. But I guess it's just what a person feel comfortable using.
And in the end, it might be the biggest tool in the shop, but it's still a tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's and you get used to what you have and whatever. What I wanted to ask you about, because you spent a lot of time talking about, if I might call, if you will pardon me the cliche, the journey, where you come from in so many ways. But where do you, again, I'm asking this question out of a personal perspective, because I have, same as you, I'm an amateur, I do other things for my living. But where do you see yourself going? Where do you want to go? What is it that you're thinking about? You know, those 2 minutes before you fall asleep in bed at night, when you are dreaming about where you want to be in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 25 years. How do you think about your woodworking journey as it carries on?
I would like to make more furniture and to sell furniture. Now, as I said, I could do a whole talk on my father, the furniture that he produced and what I was used to growing up around. But I have due to my, so I used to grow up thinking that the more marquetry, the more gilding, the more ornamentation, the better, you know. And it's a bit like with music. If anyone is a musician here,
yes,
and so I at one stage, you know, when you for piano, it was for me. You start at the beginning. You start playing more basic music. You learn about contrapunct and all of that, like Bach and Mozart. And as with time, music evolved and it became more and more complicated. And it peaked, in my opinion, for piano in Russia with people like Scriabin, Rachmaninoff, all of those sort of people. They're the big three. You know, there's Rimsky-Korsakov. There's all those people, but it became so complicated. Orchestras became so massive. You know, they started including all sorts of instruments. And it was more like that they were trying to outdo each other based on the complexity. And it gets to a point where you listen to some of these pieces, a piano concerto, for example, which is essentially, for the lesser musical people, it's a solo, you know, piano backed up by the orchestra. And you listen to something like a Rachmaninoff one, and it might go number 3 piano concerto, it goes for 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And it's a test of endurance. And when you actually listen to it and you finish listening to it, you can't listen to anything for an hour or two afterwards because it's just completely taken up your entire mental space. It's like watching the entire Lord of the Rings movies in one go, trying to do that for 9 hours. You just can't think of anything afterwards. And so when I was first, you know, learning about furniture and all of this, that was the impression that I was always under, because people are most impressed by the obvious technical things, you know, by the finer dovetails, the more dovetails that you have, you know, houndstooth dovetails, really high relief carving, you know, like Grimling Gibbons style carving, and water gilding with burnished gilt pieces. But then I realized, actually, well, who are you trying to impress, you know, and what can it all be distilled down? And that is when I sort of matured with my way of thinking, I guess you could say. And it's the same way with engineering, right? Like when you think about, when you say, what is a well-designed object? And I was having this conversation with my girlfriend's father, who used to work in the States. He worked for Northrop Grumman. He worked for Boeing. He was a structural engineer for aircraft. And so, we talk about our heroes, who our heroes were in those industries. And the Brits would love this. My hero has always been Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was a famous British engineer and the guys of that era. And from the more modern engineers, it was Kelly Johnson, who was basically a Swedish American who was in charge of the Lockheed Skunk Works. So all those 1960 spy planes, all of those things, he was in charge of. The SR-71, the first plane that was flying over 3,500 Ks an hour over Mach 3 was his brainchild. And the Dragon Lady, the U-2 spy plane. And now, when I was talking to my girlfriend's dad, he would say to me, well, what is good design? Well, a good design is something that you nail, and it doesn't need any modifications. It serves its function, and it's simple, and you can repair it. Someone else can copy the design, and execute it with ease with the minimum amount of tools. And that's actually what good design is. If you need a $100,000 setup to reproduce something, and you need an insane amount of skill to reproduce something, is that good design? Well, actually, when you think about it, it's not, right? I mean, you think about, some of the planes that come out now, some of the modern military aircraft and all of that, and they go through so much development, and they have what we call engineering changes in the engineering world. So they've locked in the design, and then they've gone, oh, dear Lord, we have to change things because, this might cause a plane to crash, or this might cause this to happen. And they have to go back and do reiterations of design. Whereas you look at something like my favorite plane, I mean, it's not a fighter plane, it was a U-2, right? It's a plane, and it was famous for having a Hasselblad camera fitted to it and being able to fly at such a high altitude and take photos of number plates on ground level, right? And it's a plane that is still used to this day. Yeah. Right. And it's still a closely guarded secret because they've never been able to better that. And it's such a simple plane, actually, when you look at it. It hasn't got moving wings. It hasn't got anything. It hasn't even got landing gear. Right. Yeah. It's like a biplane landing system. But that's good design. Yeah. So with furniture, back to what you were asking me, Matthias, I really like the Danish process of thought behind furniture. And now people say, they call, mid-mod or mid-modern century. Or
mid-century mod.
It's mid-century mod, sorry. It's anything that is just a simplified design. And I think now most people are using that as an excuse because they don't want to learn the whole gamut of skills. So they make something simple and call it mid-century modern and simplified minimalist furniture. But actually, when you look at true Danish furniture made by these Snedkermesters, which is just a cabinet making master over in Denmark. When you look at them and the people who design them, Wegener, Hans Wegener or Finn Juhl, and Finn Juhl wasn't a cabinet maker, but he was a designer who knew what he was doing. Yeah. And the blokes that they had to make them, you had, was it Fritz Hansen's, and you got Carl Hansen still working, and Willy Beck and AJ Iverson, these workshops where they had very skilled people. They knew what they were doing. And when you look at their designs, yes, they're pared down, but they're pared down to the essentials, and every part on them, every joint has an actual function. Whether it's to cope with expansion, whether it's a new hinge design that looks deceptively simple, but it's not. And that's what I really enjoy in design. And with my first workbench, for example, I did it with very loud timbers. It's got curly maple on it. It's got, the contrasting, houndstooth dovetails, very fine pins and all of that. The new workbench, which is behind me there, is to someone who's not seen joinery before. It looks far more simple than the one that I'm sitting at. It looks far more tame, far more toned down. But if you know joinery, if you got Scott to come over or whatnot and have a cigarette and a beer and have a look underneath it, he'd look at it and go, well, actually, that's harder to make than the one that you're at. And I realized actually then the people, if I try to impress anyone with any work that I do, they're the sort of people that I would rather make happy with the work that I do than someone who just has a very superficial sort of view of what it is, if that makes sense. And that also goes, sorry, go on.
Absolutely, completely. I mean, look, you are echoing my own thinking to a degree that's almost uncanny. That's good. I think the appropriate term is no worries, mate.
Yeah.
But anyway, come on, Matthias, at least attempt the accent.
Other people get on and ask their questions, but just one more before I out, and that is to say, thank you for the so many mentions of Tasmania. It's one of my favorite places on earth. I've been there a number of times.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. It's a lovely place.
Going there, I will be passing through Melbourne, and if you don't mind, I will try to give you a shout.
Please do. Please do. Yeah. Absolutely.
You'll see loads of devils on the road.
Devils?
Tasmanian devils.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of roadkill in Tassie. Wombats and stuff. Yeah. I'd encourage anyone who's ever out there to visit. It's essentially what I guess you could say. It's an island off the coast of Australia. Basically, it's a bit like what Hawaii is to the US. Maybe not that far away. You can get a boat there, but it's quite remote. It has some pristine scenery and a lot of UNESCO World Heritage sites that are very, very well protected. The Greens Party, the political party, has a lot of sway in Tasmania. And so their way of preserving those natural wonders is really quite wonderful. Yeah.
And the timbers.
Oh, fantastic timbers. Absolutely. I mean, just as a quick one, probably just so that people know, in Australia, in the southern states, we have a timber called blackwood. It's got nothing to do with African blackwood. It's an acacia. It's Acacia melanoxylon, and it's part of the acacia family, and it's very closely related to koa in Hawaii, in figuring, in colouring, and in the way that you would work it as well with regards to the hardness and the density and stuff like that. And it grows in Tasmania and in the southern part of Victoria, especially in the Otways rainforest, which is about 2 hours drive or 3 hours drive from where I am. I've got a piece of it. Give me a sec. I'll just find a piece so you all know what it looks like. So, I mean, the white balance of my computer is probably off, but that's not a figured piece by any means. I'll just turn the fluoro, whoops, no, sorry. That's what it looks like. It works extremely well. It's probably slightly harder than mahogany. It's about 670, 680 kilos per cubic meter in density. Depends where it grows. The older growth stuff is slightly more dense, but it finishes absolutely beautifully. I've got, as I said, I've got photos. If you've got any specific photo, any specific sort of photos that you want me to show, I could show you a photo of my tool cabinet. That's from Blackwood, just to give you an idea what it looks like. But yeah, sorry, I hate rambling on.
That's all right. We're on to, I think, Jim. Next question.
Yeah.
Hey, Siggy, how are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. Yeah, well, no, I'm not fine, but yeah, I'm here. So yeah, I'm spaced out my head, so don't worry about that.
That's all right.
I know I've been privileged to witness the growth of your bench through our conversations in private of a private nature, and I think one of the things that strikes me as being required to be shown tonight is the joinery relating to the screws and the actual vices themselves, because that is beautifully done in a way that is considered to be traditional, and sometimes making wooden screws, etc., is considered to be old-fashioned if you're comparing with bench crafted, etc. But the way you've done it and your link with your friend in Queensland, I think it needs to be spoken about. So if you could give us a few seconds on that, maybe some
Okay.
shots or photographs of that, that would be something
Okay.
everyone would
I didn't
appreciate.
actually- let me see if I can just find some. Oh shoot! Where do I have my workbench? What I'll probably do, because I've got some of the photos on Instagram. I can share my screen and just go onto
Sure.
onto the internet.
I mean,
there
I'm sure
and-
we'd all appreciate another talk at some point in the spring,
Yeah.
late spring, early summer.
By all means.
Once you've used it, to go into absolute detail specifically on that subject. But just
Yeah.
to whet
So
some
I could,
appetites.
So I could start off with, let's say, the screws. So the traditional way, and Matthias can attest to it, is with wooden screws. And so I don't have any metal sort of vice hardware on the workbench. Give me a second. I'll just get one of them.
It's the way that you actually created them, because a lot of people struggle with creating large screws.
Yep, I'm with you. So this is the shoulder vise screw from my workbench. Let me just take the handle off. So I did say the workbench was predominantly Australian timbers, except for the handles, because what actually happened was, right before I made the handles, there's a show called Grand Designs, it's an architectural show, and we have an Australian version of it. And I helped a guy produce some furniture for a Grand Designs build at the 11th hour, quite literally. The night before, we were there from sort of 5 p.m. till 3 a.m. And as a thank you, because he used to collect timbers, he gave me a couple of pieces of coco bolo and some rosewood burl, little chunks. And so the handles were made as a birthday present by Frank to me from those materials. I don't have a lathe. So the actual screw, though, the business end of it all, so the timber is a timber called, it hasn't really, some people call it certain things and others call it other things. Frank calls it scented Queensland maple. It's different to Queensland maple, which is the main sort of, so we don't have maple trees, the Acer trees here in Australia. We have them in an ornamental capacity, but we don't grow them. We don't have the climate to grow them. So in Queensland, in that northern state, they have a timber which is part of the Flindasia group of trees, and its wood looks a lot like hard maple in regards to coloration. And it's a great tone wood as well for guitars. And when it gets its quilted figuring, it looks just like maple. And so they called it colloquially Queensland maple. So this is scented Queensland maple. So it's not that Queensland maple. It's a far less common relative of that tree. It has a scent, as the name suggests. It's slightly waxy, but it was cut down and obtained by Frank as 4x4s, probably about 30 years ago from one of his mates who ran a timber yard up there. It's extremely stable. It machines extremely well, and it cuts very cleanly. And that's why we used it as the vice screw. So this was initially turned up on a pattern lathe. Now, you might say, why a pattern lathe? Well, Frank nowadays, in his older age, he specializes in historic bookbinding presses. You can actually Google him. It's Wiesner Woodcraft is his website. And he basically in the 80s, he was asked for someone who was a historic bookbinder to make a sewing stand for sewing the books, the spines of books, and a press, all from timber, the way they did it all those years ago. And he made a couple, and they sold like hotcakes, and mainly to people in Europe and in the US. And he's since specialized in that. So he uses a pattern vise to rough out his blanks for wood screws in all different sizes. So we made a pattern for a workbench screw, and so it's roughed out on the pattern lathe, sorry. And then he built his own contraption using a woodworking lathe and essentially an angle grinder and a cutter head that he had made for himself, and a big lead screw and a combination of gears on the side, a whole mechanism that basically is powered off a power feed for, you know, like a spindle molder. And so it rotates at a very slow RPM, and it turns this huge lead screw that he's fabricated and put on the front, and it moves this angle grinder with its cutter on the horizontal axis. And at a speed relative to that, which is determined by a set of gears that he has at the end, which he can change in and out, he can actually vary the threads per inch. And he can then also rotate the head of that angle grinder in all axes to change the land and the geometry of the actual thread itself. Now, it's not just a random process that he has. He actually understands timber on a very much an engineering sort of a level, and he will change the geometry according to the timber. And he knows just how much slop to have to compensate for that expansion and contraction. And so that's how that was made.
And how did you make the female? How did you make the female?
Yeah, good question. That was done with a massive tap.
All right.
That he had, I believe he had made. Now he actually constructed, so he's grown up in, you know, rural Queensland, or not grown up, he's been based out there, I should say, since the 50s, working on farms. He initially worked on a dairy farm when he came out, before getting back into cabinet making. That was just to make ends meet. But his mindset is very much that he'll make everything. So he built his own dust extraction system, including the fan blades and everything in the blower, and his own filtration system. And he's not trained as an engineer, he's a cabinet maker. It's just he has that mindset. And he built this contraption that's a tapping machine. Essentially, it's a horizontal boring machine powered off a huge, I don't know if it's a 6-pole or an 8-pole 3-phase electric motor that rotates at a relatively low RPM. And it's belt driven, and it drives a massive flywheel that I think is an old tractor wheel or something like that at a very slow RPM, but it's a juggernaut. It doesn't stop. And you essentially clamp your block into there that you want to tap, and it'll tap itself. It'll just pull itself in, and then you can back it out. He's got a little a stop switch on there that'll stop it, and then he'll reverse polarity and back it out. And considering, like, I mean, I'm an engineer and I worked in prototyping and then tooling manufacture and everything. The fact that he was able to do that just blew my mind. And his workshop, he's not strictly hand tools, even though we can do everything by hand, has a lot of fascinating things like that, which are just boggle anyone's mind. He has no, people expect with the level of stuff that he makes and the quality that there's a lot of festool and brand new sort of fancy tools and stuff. But his belt sander, for example, was a 1950s Black & Decker, which is still going strong, and he wouldn't change it for anything else. And he does everything with that. He doesn't use random orbital sanders or fancy this or fancy that. So, but yeah, back to that. That's how that was made. And I made the knob actually patterned off the traditional sort of Swedish Scandinavian shape that they use.
It's absolutely beautiful. I think we could be here all night just talking about the screw, let alone the bench. So I'm sure that, you know, everybody would agree with me that we would love to invite you back to do just a unique presentation on that. Just to thank you so much for getting up so stupidly early in the morning. I think we all knew it would be a gem of a presentation, and it certainly has been. So thank you so much for doing that, and I'll let somebody else have an opportunity. Thanks, Siggy.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much, Jim. Over to you, Chester.
Hey there, that was terrific. Great.
Thanks,
great.
Chester.
And I can obviously see that you could go on and on and on and on, and none of us would be bored or complaining about it.
Well, I've actually got another 2 hours, so ask as many questions as you want. I'm okay. I just need my coffee, which is okay. I've got it here.
Yeah. I'm a little foggy because I'm on pain medications for my hand right now, but I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to just bring up, when I went to Australia, I threw away a lot of my clothing because I needed the space in my luggage to bring back a lot of wood, and including and I don't know if you mentioned Banksia.
Oh yes.
Is that what was the tree that you planted outside of your shop?
So that's actually not a tree that's used typically for woodworking. So that's a shrub called the swamp banksia. I like it because it looks quite grotesque. It's sort of like only his mum could kind of love him kind of a thing. And it's fast growing, and it has lovely, huge, prickly leaves, which I just like the look of, because it's literally right outside the window there. That's why I planted it.
One of the fascinating things when I went to Uluru was they were talking about the forests, the Banksia forests, that because England had taken over those forests from the Aborigines, they no longer propagated that forest, and it was dying off. And when it was returned to the natives immediately burned it. And the English were quite shocked that they burned it. And the burning is the only way, it's the heat that makes the pods send out the seed that propagate the trees. And so I wanted to show real quickly, I brought back several of these. And you should be certainly familiar with them. But they're fascinating because they're this is the seed pod of the Banksia, and the seeds come out of these holes. And it's interesting because it also has this very fuzzy end. You see, it's almost like fur. And so I brought back several of these and turned them. And this is one it's so incredibly dense. It's ugly looking and interesting. But this is it turned on the lathe. It's a little pear. But I left some of that fuzziness goes through. I don't see if you can see that there. But so these holes here are the same as these. Basically, I turned it out of that. And I was fascinated with the density of a lot of the Australian hardwoods, including the Banksia. And so a great presentation, and I'm hoping to someday go back there, and I won't bring as much clothing, but I don't have to throw it away. But I just loved it, and it was an amazing experience. And I have to say that I have to commend you on the things that you have done and your background and how much knowledge you have at your age, as you admitted to earlier, and appreciate you doing this. Thanks, for us. Hope to see you again soon. I'm probably not going to stay on too much longer because I'm kind of fuzzy with the stuff. But
you're right. You're right. All good.
I wanted to make you a compliment. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chester.
Take care, man.
Thank you very much, Chester. I hope your hands you recover with your hands soon. Over to you, Mike. You might have to unmute. Welcome. I don't believe you've joined us before. If you have, I don't think you've asked a question.
Right. Have you got me?
Hey. Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks very much for the talk. Enjoyed that. Sorry I came in late, so I'm not sure what I missed. I spent some of my childhood in Melbourne. I was there for 4 years, so I'm a little bit familiar with Australian timbers. And I'm doing some green oak work at the moment, very traditional English, mortise and tenon joinery in soaking wet, freshly cut oak. And so I was wondering if there was an Australian tradition of working timbers green, unseasoned, for timber framing, the first settlers' houses, that sort of thing. I don't know. I imagine the English went out there and tried to do the same sort of thing with Australian timbers as they did with the timbers with the oak back here.
You're absolutely right, Mike. That there was that scene is not. So one thing, just for everyone in this conversation to understand, is Australia is massive. I think there's a photo I was going to show of Australia versus the US. Like, so we're almost not quite as big as the US, but our population is far smaller. You know, it's far smaller than that of the UK.
It was 13 million when I lived there.
So yeah, so yeah, I remember being in primary school in the 90s, and it was sort of just clocked over 15 million, and now there's 25 million or so. But given the space, it's tiny, and each state, because the timbers vary from state to state. If you're in Queensland, you've got the rainforest timbers, and if you're in Western Australia, that's where Jarrah grows. Carry, exactly. And if you're in the territory, in the Northern Territory, which is what Chester mentioned before, you've got some other hardwoods there. You've got casuarinas in New South Wales. You've got blackbutt. You've got all these extremely dense eucalypts, and so really the woodworking, I think, from those early settlers, given that they didn't have tool steels back then, it was all forged high carbon steels. I guess their building techniques and ways of working the timber were really dictated by the timbers that they were working. I mean, if you're more so fortunate to be in Tasmania, I wouldn't say you're fortunate at the time because Tasmania was a penal colony.
I was going to say.
You were generally a prisoner if you were down there or on a chain gang. But if you were down in Tassie, they have softer timbers that were more conducive to handwork. But there is definitely a green wood building tradition. You do, if you go up north, you find a lot of buildings using solid spotted gum beams, and in WA they use a solid Jarrah beams. And these beams, I mean, I used some on my workbench that I built for the base of the workbench, and they're almost 200 years old and dry as anything. And
is it a railway sleeper?
No, it was a roof beam from a government building that got pulled down in Queensland. So bone dry, but I mean harder than hickory, and silica in there that like teak, like Burmese teak.
I watched my dad try and work Jarrah.
Oh, it's brutal. It's brutal. You can't use, people often think, of Japanese planes and the fine shavings and even the English infill planes. That's really not the way we can work most of those extremely hard timbers economically. The use of abrasives is quite common here in finishing. But I mean, back to what you're going into with green woodworking and chairs. I actually know of two guys in Australia now who are very famous for Windsor chairs.
And I didn't mention chair. I mean,
yeah.
I'm making a pergola at the moment, for goodness sake.
Okay.
It's not chair, but chair making. Carry on. I'm
making.
Just as interested.
So I believe there was a guy in Tasmania, maybe called Jimmy Possum, a while back, who was making very rustic kind of chairs. This is like 150 years ago. He's a bit of a legendary character. But in current modern day Australia, there's really two blokes, a guy called Glenn Rundell and a guy called Bern Chandley. And Glenn's a former plumber. He'd be in his late 40s or maybe early 50s. He can correct me if I've quoted the wrong age and he watches this. And Bern, I think, is about in his late 40s. He was a former carpenter. And I believe the two of them actually trained in the US with, I don't know if it was Peter Galbert or some of these famous chair makers. They went over there, and both of them, I believe, had very sort of life-changing experiences in regards to wanting to build Windsor chairs and make woodworking part of their lifestyle. And they're the only guys I know of. And there are probably a couple of others out there who are doing green woodworking, mainly in chair making though, There is a young guy that I found out about, I say he's in his 30s, and he's doing timber framing in, I think, southern New South Wales with an axe and the traditional way. And he uses incredibly hard timbers. God knows how many times a day he has to sharpen his tools. So there are a couple out there. The network here is not as close knit, and because we're so sparsely, populated and separated, it's not, and we don't have that history. For most people, I mean, who don't know, Australia was, it was only founded like a couple of hundred years ago.
As 1,000 years ago, but
oh, true, I should say Europeans only came out here and settled. The Brits only really settled in the late 1700s. So we're young in that way. We don't have that depth of timber framing and culture and furniture making that Europe is so lucky to have, and the Americas are so lucky to have too.
I'm curious that you talk about the working these timbers when they're green and still being hard. I mean, the oak that I'm working at the moment is, I mean, it's well over 30% moisture. If you put a drill in and pull it out, it will spin water off the drill bit.
Wow.
And it's like, until you hit a knot, it's like very hard cheese. It's as easy as anything to work. But obviously when oak dries up, when it seasons, it gets rather harder than that. So one would expect that the Aussie timbers, whilst green, would be easier to work than when they're seasoned.
I would lean towards that too. But having said that, as you know, I mean, for some who don't know, let's just say that the really common hardwoods that are popular here, like blackbutt or spotted gum, to give you an idea as to how hard they are or dense they are, hard maple, which is considered, like, if you're in the US or in Canada, that's one of the bread and butter timbers, is sort of, or European beech. They're roughly equal. They're around that 700 kilo mark, or just over 700 kilo per cubic meter.
Right.
The spotted gum, when it's seasoned, and blackbutt, they're around that 950 kilo per cubic meter, and even jarrah is that 850 kilo per cubic meter. And when you actually look into the mechanical properties of it, the tensile strength, modulus of elasticity, when you break that all down, which is what I did when I designed my vise and everything like that, so I knew sort of the tolerances that I needed and everything, they're significantly, 40-50% stronger than what people in Europe would consider the hardest of hardwoods, and the strongest of sort of the timbers.
I mean, just as an anecdote, my dad, I remember watching him when I was probably 10 or 12, he made some quadrant and then tried to pin the quadrant into place, I don't know, in the kitchen or something, and out of jarrah, and you couldn't get a nail in it. He had to, you had to pre-drill every nail hole just to pin it into place with little, 25 mil thin pins. It's impossible stuff. Beautiful, lovely timber, but not the easiest thing to. And not sort of on the same subject, another thing I'm doing quite a lot of at the moment is carving, low relief carving. And so I was going to, I don't know how much I've missed, and whether you talked about this, but we carve all sorts of timbers over here, and seasoned oak is, significantly hard, and but is carved all the time, and all the church carvings and what have you is all, not all, but mainly oak. Is there, I guess the timings are a bit wrong really, but is there any tradition in Australia of carving Australian
there is. Yeah, so in Europe, if you look at, say, Grinling Gibbons or any of those what's his name? My favorite one, the German one, Riemenschneider. Oh, anyway, slipped my mind. They used to use a lot of lindenwood, or in the US, basswood or basswood, whatever, however you pronounce it. In Australia, we have a timber like that called Australian white beech. It's got nothing to do with beech. Again, we have a lot of colloquial names that the early settlers, often they would find a tree and they found it felt similar to something that they used in Europe or in the US or whatnot, or it looked similar, and they just gave it that name. And so for us, it's white beech. I'm not a wood carver, but I know a very, very good wood carver in Toowoomba who lives, he's very close friends with Frank. They used to demonstrate at shows together. His name is Bruce Weir. He's of German descent, and he loves Greenland gibbons, and he does a lot of, his wife is Scottish, and he does a lot of interesting floral things with like thistles and things, and gum leaves on the other side.
I mean, Gremlin Gibbons was very 3D and high relief carving. I'm more into the low relief carving, the sort of Jacobean and what have you, tradition, scratch carving, chip carving, that sort of thing. Very standard set of patterns, but highly decorative and what have you, but not very deep. So just curious to know what's going on in Australia. And I'd also say to you, I've got 20 or 30 years more woodworking in me than you have, than you've done. Don't dismiss it. Don't call yourself not a carver. It came to me late. Particularly, I enjoy your comments on the highly figured timbers, and I've never liked highly figured timbers. I much prefer using plain timbers and making something interesting of them, and carving sort of feeds into that. It does. When you find yourself looking at a piece of furniture you've made and thinking, that could just do with a bit of let's just add something to that. You might pick up a gouge and a mallet and have a little play on some scrap first, because you can mess up a good piece of furniture. But don't dismiss don't leave the carving to the German guy up the road. Have a crack yourself.
I will.
Right, I'll leave you to it. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure there's others who've got something to ask you. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks for joining us. I hope you'll stay on to the after party as well.
I don't know how you guys know each other.
We've been talking for the last almost 2 years now.
I've seen some of them on YouTube. I've seen them afterwards, but it's like you all know each other
through staying on
through this. Is it just through COVID?
Yeah. So over to you, Kyle.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that really drew me into making in the arts was I love the history and how the techniques develop. And like a big noticeable one would be like the difference between, as you said, like Japanese, when you have like pull saws and kanas, and then like Western, which you have push saws. And I was curious with Australia and the colonization being relatively recent, how has woodworking developed before and after? And have you ever noticed anything that's distinctly unique about Australian woodworking, other than the hardwoods, obviously, which we beat to death?
Yep. So with regards to tooling, because we were an English colony, I guess you could say, very traditionally, English tools, push saws, not bow saws, not frame saws, which is what I'm used to using. They were sort of the mainstay. We have if you want to go out and buy a vintage tool here, generally it's fairly easy to find a lot of English-made Stanley kind of products. So Stanley planes, Yeah, Lee Nielsen planes, incredibly popular in Australia. And your traditional European style, like bevel gauges and squares and things like that. The Japanese sort of front has gained quite a fair bit of following here in Australia, but that's still relatively modern. It's a little bit like how it happened in the US. You know, there was this sort of a awareness that came about and everything, except the US has a lot more timbers that are conducive to being worked in the Japanese style. Because I love Japan. Japan's actually one of my favorite places to go, and I've been there numerous times. And when I spoke to cabinet makers or woodworkers from Japan, carpenters, they were always telling me, you know, their skills, their techniques, the way that they hold their timber with their hands and feet is only possible because of the types of timber that they're using. A lot of it extremely high quality straight grain spruce and things like that, and or cypresses and stuff like that. Now you can't, you can apply those techniques to Aussie timbers, and there are some people doing that. But like, this is where my manufacturing and engineering mindset comes in and says, yeah, there is a romantic element. You can do that, but if you actually want to be a production man and you want to efficiently do something, you can't directly translate those sort of tools. So we've got a couple of, we've got one famous tool maker, really, Terry Gordon, who makes H&T Gordon planes, hand planes. He actually was, I believe, a navigator in the Air Force, Australian Air Force, and he was stationed, I believe, in Malaysia, probably in the 1980s, early 1990s. And he observed people using the push planes. Essentially, they look like a Japanese plane, but you push them, they got a handle. And he came back to Australia and he thought, you know, to experiment with that, but change the design to suit working Australian timbers. And when he changed the design, he put the bed angle at 60 degrees and he started using high-speed steel blades and thick ones. Like, I'm talking about like 1/4 of an inch thick blades, no chip breaker. And I've got one of his hand planes here. They've got very fine wooden mouths. He has a preference because the higher your bed angle is, the more of a scraping action it is. And with the silica that you have in Australian timbers, like if you try to make a plane with a 3-inch wide blade, you got to be Arnold Schwarzenegger to push that thing. So you can't really hog off a lot of material with each pass. And the way the mechanics of the blade, if you were to use a vanadium steel or a standard high carbon steel, you would always need to sharpen it. So he uses, I believe, an 18% tungsten alloyed tool steel, which is you need diamond stones to sharpen it. It doesn't get quite as razor sharp, in my honest opinion, as, let's say, an old Buck Brothers iron, or a Ward iron, or a Sheffield steel iron that's laminated, but it will hold its edge. And I mean, when you talk about woodworking, and we get so tempted, I believe, nowadays, and this is maybe just my own view, but by the marketing of ultimate sharpness, you know, like you need 10 different sharpening stones, you need to go up to 40,000 grit, 50, 100, whatever, you know, infant grit, right? And sit there for an hour, hour and a half sharpening one hand plane blade. Well, as any professional who has worked in that industry would ever tell you as a joiner, that's not feasible. I mean, you don't want to be spending 90% of your time sharpening your stuff. You want to get it to like a serviceable level of sharpness. And what his thought process is in using those tool steel blades is, yes, they don't have that same ultimate level of sharpness, but they will maintain that sort of 80% absolute sharpness for a much longer period of time, which is actually what you practically need. And realistically, everyone out there is sanding everything anyway afterwards, so you don't need you know, to have a mirror finish off the hand plane blade. So yeah, that's, I guess you could say, long story short, that we mainly have that European influence in push tools and English style workbenches. We've got our own manufacturer of record style vices called Dawn. And Dawn is actually just 5 kilometers from where I live in an industrial lot. And they basically make their own version of the traditional record vise with the quick release or without the quick release. So we're very much rooted in that. With regards to furniture design, a lot of the actual furniture designs that we have, now I'm not an antique specialist or anything, but a lot of that you can see a lot of English influence, a heck of a lot of English influence. Less so continental European influence, just in the shape of the legs and the way they assemble things, and the overall silhouette tends to look a lot more English. But now with the internet and social media, the trend seems to be more minimalist and a lot more of an Oriental kind of a vibe to it. Yeah.
So that being the case, one of the other things that I've spent a lot of time doing is watching musical instruments being created. And one of the things I've always been curious about, but I never remembered to look up, is how do they get the hole through the didgeridoo?
Oh God, I actually, you know, I've got a mate called Willie who is a timber cutter. He's South African, came out here in the 80s, but he took to the indigenous community like, you know, he loves it. And he's actually mad into didgeridoos. And the didgeridoos are not just, to anyone who's unsure, didgeridoo is not just a wooden tube that you just, you know, blow into. It holds a significant spiritual kind of a significance to the indigenous people of Australia. It's like what the bagpipes are to the Scots. That's what the didgeridoo is to the indigenous here in Australia. It is, and it's serious business for them. And different trees give different tones, and they signify, I believe, and Willie would be the right person to ask, they hold different sort of significance. Now, to hollow it out, I don't know. I've never seen a didgeridoo being made. I'd have to ask Willie, but I do know that the Aborigines, the indigenous, used to burn timber out when they wanted to remove it at times, because they didn't have, they didn't forge tools. There was no steel business in Australia. We're now known for mining. I mean, I've worked in that industry, but I mean, 200 years ago, none of that existed. Like, it was essentially, they were still using Stone Age type tools.
Actually, I own an original Australian didgeridoo.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, mine was eaten, the whole was eaten by termites. It's natural wood, just to chime in. So
that makes sense.
That was the original technique.
Extremely hard timber as well, I bet. Yeah, I'm sure you could use a didgeridoo as a weapon in self-defense if you had to.
It's an antique.
Absolutely.
Termite-teak, yeah.
Antique.
Carl, does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah,
we'll move on to Eric.
Hi, Siggy. That was a fantastic talk. I mean, that really blew me away. And you've also blown away all my questions that other people have asked, almost everything that I wanted to ask. But
sorry.
One of the things that you know, I really love about you and your work is your eclectic background, the way you've picked up all these different skills, and they all influence your mindset and how you think. Is there any one thing that you think was really important and sort of fundamental in making you the woodworker that you are today?
In regards to design or mindset?
Both, I think. Yeah.
Probably the resourcefulness from a mindset perspective. From my father, that was something I learned from him. So I could do a whole talk on him, and I've got photos that I could show you actually if I share screen. Do you mind if I share screen and then I'll just talk you through?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, so let me know if you can see my screen. Oh, hang on, I haven't hit share, have I?
Yeah, you've got to hit share. There you go.
Yeah. So you can see it?
Usually helps, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so right, where should I start? So there you go. Okay, so that's a photo you know. So that's my father at home in the 90s. That's another frame we did a couple of years later when I was in high school in the home workshop. Now I'll just find some, that's him working on all the compo there. Now you have to understand, my father produces frames like this. This is in the State Library of Victoria, this frame, and this one hangs next to it. Or actually they're on opposite sides of a wall. Huge frames, absolutely massive. They weigh an absolute ton. And, you know, months of work in each, and that's months of work at his devilishly, you know, furious pace that he works at, which is just unbelievable. Now, what you don't know is, what most people might think is that he's got quite a well-equipped workshop. Now, I've got a photo, I can't find it, but I've got a photo where he cut the miters on those frames, and he used a handheld Makita carpenter's circular saw, which you say that to someone and they would just say that's unbelievable. Like that's not possible. But that was, he had the thing, and he'll admit it too. Back then, you know, now he's got sort of a little bit of glaucoma and he's 73 and his back's a bit crooked, but he will admit that at that time he was game to just do it, you know, just get stuck into it. He had that confidence. And that's him when he was, so he is a marquetarian as well. He does marquetry. That would be in the late 70s. My mum would have taken this photo when they were probably just dating. So probably around 78, 79. He was in his early 30s. He was at one stage in the 80s, they rebuilt Parliament House here in Australia. They didn't rebuild it, they built a new Parliament House, which is, for those in the US, it's like the Congress, like that huge, or Capitol building, that's the one. And it was designed by an Italian, and they wanted a lot of marquetry panels. And they approached a couple of people, and my dad was one of those considered. In the end, he got turned off and he withdrew because he had just taken out a mortgage and he wanted a solid income, and his government job at the National Gallery afforded him that solid, reliable income. But he was capable of doing very fine work. And these pictures here you see hanging up were around the house as I grew up. So it was all around me. The veneers, a lot of them he actually obtained by what we call dumpster diving. He would go around to cabinet shops and he used to pose and say that he was an English high school teacher and he was teaching crafts, and could I please look in your bins for offcuts? And that's how he got all his veneers. And then later on, he started, he was judging shows and judging furniture making shows, and people would then, you know, hook him up with the right people to get veneers from. But that's actually how most of his work was done. This photo here is taken at National Gallery. It was a particular frame that he restored using all hand tools and traditional approaches, something that they deemed at the time basically impossible, especially for one person to do. And he was very proud of that when he did that. That's him at the National Gallery, gilding. You might notice he wears a lab coat, a dust coat, and in his industry where he worked, and Anton can probably relate to this, the guys who sort of get to the top of their sort of craft in cabinetry and all that, they sort of wore a white dust coat. It was their sort of way of saying, sort of, I'm the professor. The silent sort of, you know, just a bit like if you're in the military and you've got your 5 stars on your shoulder, you know, and you're a 5-star general or something. It's the same thing. And this is him in his mid-30s with the compo work for a frame for a John Longstaff painting called The Sirens, which still hangs. No one has since been able to replicate. That's it there, proudly standing next to it. This is some work that he did too. This was a private client, a guy who was in the medical profession who has since died. So when my dad worked from home, he had a lot of very tough times because we don't have that depth of culture in Australia. And it's nothing, that's not a criticism. That's just the matter of fact. We just don't have the same depth as the UK or continental Europe does. And so the market for such work is very, very small. And this guy was probably the only guy that my dad shed a tear for when he passed away, because he kept our family on the drip feed with money at one point in time when I was in high school. So I didn't have my own brand new high school uniform till I was in VCE, which is like the final 2 years of school. Everything else was secondhand because we had a rough time. And this guy, Dr. Coombe was his name, would even pay my dad just to sit in the workshop and observe him. He was a former surgeon, and he was the only guy that called my dad Mr. Chaloupka as a form of respect. And they had a very mutual understanding and friendship that was really, it's quite wonderful, actually. This is just some random stuff hanging around my dad's house, his phone number and his what they call a Schreinerwappe on the left. It's like the coat of arms of a cabinet maker, and the chisel and the mallet in the middle, and the gilding tools on the left there, and that's hanging on their back porch now. Now, I said he made his own tools. He's got his own smithy in his backyard. That is actually the size of it. It's tiny. It's probably only, as you can see, 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters, very small. He built it himself. I believe a lot of the bricks that he got, he found scattered by the side of a railway tracks. So he would, very resourceful guy, he'd walk the dog every morning, the German Shepherd, and every walk he'd pick up a brick and just carry it home. And you do that every day, twice a day. And that's how he built the pizza oven out the back of the house. And that's how he built a lot of other stuff. A very resourceful guy. He did, this is him in the gallery when he finished that frame, holding the hammer and the saw proudly to signify that he used a lot of hand tools. And this is him at his workbench. He always believed, and he always liked that with English woodworkers, the idea of a person taking pride in their clothes, even when they're working, doing something, you know, in quotation marks, dirty. He had a thing for English brogues, and he always wore a beautiful pair of brogues, even though he couldn't afford it, to work, and a pair of corduroy pants, because corduroy is a traditional fabric that carpenters in Germany have in their pants. And he wore corduroy pants, brogues, and a white dust coat. And when he worked, he wore, you know, Doc Martens because they could get glue on them and it was okay. But he always believed in taking pride, and that if you are sharply dressed, the work you perform will be sharp, because it shows that you consider every aspect of your work. And this is what I was probably alluding to. This is a table he made.
Oh, wow.
A rather complicated table from walnut, and he gets very homesick of Germany, and so oak leaves are a thing for him, for any European, I guess. And he made this table. Now, this was what captured the attention of the folks at the gallery and why they put him forward to do some work on Parliament House. Would you believe it? He made this table not in a workshop. He didn't have a workshop. He didn't have any stationary power tools or anything. He did a lot of this in the kitchen of a flat that he lived in with my mum that they were renting. And out of a toolbox, a little tool tote like the one that I have, with a little electric router, a jigsaw, a little electric hand planer, a Makita hand planer, and just his traditional German tools, hand tools. And he produced this, and people just couldn't believe the result, using the most basic tools and that attitude of nothing can stop me. If I want to do it, and if I stick to it, I can do it. And I think what you were getting to, Eric, was, you know, you're saying what influences, and for my mindset, it was that. And I think that's another talk that I could give another time, but it's big, that came to him from his harsh upbringing. He was his family were from an area called Sudetenland, which is in the Czech Republic now. They were displaced. They were essentially told to get on a train and get into Germany during the war. And he was born after the war in 48 in essentially a displaced persons camp in the south of Germany. And they couldn't fit back into Germany because they weren't locals. The locals didn't want them. And they lived it tough. And, you know, his mum passed away when he was young, and his dad, given his background and his involvement with in the war, which was forced upon him. He was actually a mill builder who was actually a cop. And you see, when you're Hitler and you want to start a war, the first place you go to find officers is the police, because they've got the training already. It just makes logical sense. And it was more sort of you're either with us or without us, against us. And given that he had a young family at the time, this is my grandfather, and it was right, well, I want to survive, so I have to. And he came out a pretty scarred fella afterwards, having spent a lot of time in North Africa with Rommel, and then in Stalingrad, which is about the most horrible place for anyone to be. So my dad grew up around this, basically, and around a lot of hunger. You know, there's one side, all the old Germans that he grew up around, they were saying, you know, hate the Americans, right? Probably a bit like if you're a young Afghan child in Afghanistan, you hear all these old people saying, you know, hate the Americans. But at the same time, he was conflicted because he grew up in, you know, with very minimal food and no clothes on his back. And American soldiers took pity on him. And when he was doing his apprenticeship in the 60s, it was when the Vietnam War was just starting up. And something that still brings him to tears, and that, you know, it's quite touching when you talk to him about it, is hunger. He believes no one, no matter where they come from, should be hungry. And the other thing is he remembers, as he would go back to the hostel in the evenings from his when he was doing his apprenticeship, he would pass the pubs and he would see young American soldiers, you know, essentially just out of school, and they were bawling their tears out, bawling their eyes out, crying, because they were scared of going to Vietnam. And he would talk to them, or try to talk to them, or his friends would talk to them, and they were just farm boys. And he realized that you know, this, it doesn't matter, you know, what side you're on, it's all politics and all this. And at the bottom of it, you know, these are just innocent, good-hearted people. And that was how he sort of had a soft spot towards them. And that's that sort of tough upbringing that he had. And one of the reasons why he ended up leaving Germany, as to how he formed that sort of like never give up kind of a mentality, kind of a thing. And if you put your mind to it and cut the distractions out, you can achieve surprisingly more than you would expect that you can. And I think the results really speak for themselves in what he has achieved. Now, with regards to design, because I was brought up not around English furniture and that. My dad was homesick, so the furniture that he built around the house, he built a room under the house. He calls it, you know, the Keller or the cellar. And it's got all carvings. It's lined with carvings and marquetry of deers and you know, stag horns hanging up on the wall and everything. You would think that you are in Austria or in Bavaria or something like that. And that had a huge impact on me. So the silhouettes, some people who have seen the stuff that I have made have said, gee, the stuff you make, Siggy, like from a distance, the shape, it looks like something you would find in Europe or in Denmark or in Sweden or something like that. You know, the way you use chamfers and radiuses and stuff, radii, and the tools you use. But then the little details I like from that Cotswold kind of stuff. Chamfers, stop chamfers, they're my favorite thing. Everything you see that I do, I use stop chamfers. And I get to them with, you know, with rasps and things, and I think it brings an organic element into furniture. So, but I mean, I guess observers of stuff that I have produced are probably better positioned to comment on that. I do have a soft spot for Macassar ebony, not because it's rare, but because my mum is actually from the same place in Indonesia where they harvest Makassar ebony. So my grandfather's brother used to sell it. Makassar ebony, he used to harvest it. So it's that has got a soft spot in my sort of heart.
Oh, wow. No, it's amazing to hear all that. You know, add this sort of colour and depth to what you've been talking about. I think your father sounds like a very inspirational character, and I can see where you inherited your skill from, basic hand skills, but also the attitude to being able to do things. Nowadays, I feel we're far too sort of consumer orientated. You need to get the biggest and the best machine you can get to do it. You know, it's like the new Yankee workshop that's influenced so many people. Particularly in America, and the standard question you get asked, oh, that's lovely, do you have plans for that? Because you get your plans and you can throw wood through some machines and you can produce beautiful stuff. But it's not, I like things that are in that sort of crossover between art and the artistry and the craft and the skill, rather than just the output from a machine, because anybody can use a machine, really. Using it well is a bit of a skill, but anybody can use a machine. But to cut dovetails like these ones that you did by hand is a definite skill that not everybody's got, not at all.
So I should point out, like you might see on the cover there, on the screen, they were some of the dovetails I cut. This is the first time I'd ever done dovetails like this. Okay, so it doesn't, when I speak to some people, I say, how did you cut them on your first project like that? And they think I just pick up the saw and I start cutting. Or I've got some jigs or some sort of blocks that I use when I chiseled it all out to keep my my chisel square and everything like that. The answer is no. So what people can't see, what I actually did was I took a step back and I said, this is what I want to achieve. And what I did was I went out to a friend who has a joinery workshop, and he had offcuts, already dimension milled timber offcuts of a timber called Vic Ash, which is like our standard hardwood. But it is a hardwood, and it's got very similar cutting and working characteristics to, say, maple. It's not quite as nice to work. And what I did was I spent 3 weeks, and I applied that same mentality as I did when I did piano. So one of the things when you play piano or any musical instruments is you've got exercises you do. You do scales, you might do what they call arpeggios. Anyone who's played an instrument can relate to that. You do repetition after repetition because that's all it is. And all I did was I marked the angle and I marked it to a depth on about 10 pieces of timber every night. And I cut the angle. I made about, I cut about across a 4-inch wide piece of timber that was probably 1.5 inches thick. I made about 6 cuts. And then I would split them and split them again and essentially make a cone. And I didn't want to have to keep marking lines, so I just tried by eye. I tried to train myself by eye to maintain an even distance and to get confident with that. And before even touching these dovetails, I spent 3 weeks every night for about 45 minutes and just doing that. And it sounds crazy. People say, you can't do that. Yes, you can. I don't own a TV, so I sold my TV. I just put on some music or whatnot. I don't believe in having headphones on or anything like that, because I believe that when you do something like that, you should listen to the timber with the saw. You can tell if you're going too aggressively and you can back yourself off, even though your hands may not feel it, you can hear it. And just repetition after repetition after repetition after repetition. And I went through all this scrap timber before I did this, before I cut this. And that was the only way that I could do it. There's no way in hell I could do this straight off the bat. That's just a fact of life. So, and in the end, look, I think it was worth it. It took me 3 weeks to get that right. And I just made sure I set the time aside every night, the same way that someone goes to the gym every morning and lifts weights for an hour or so, and they get muscly at the end and they say, how'd you get so big? Well, it doesn't come overnight. It's just you stick to it. And I do that with everything that I do, because at the end of the day, I'm a hobbyman. I'm not at the tools 10 hours a day. So I break down what I'm trying to do. And that's sort of my engineering mindset, is I break down what I'm trying to do. I try to work out what are the most common techniques, and if you can cut tenons, bridle joints, finger joints with a handsaw, you can cut dovetails, because it's the same thing. You're just cutting to a line. And I try to figure out what are the skills that I use the most like that, that are most interchangeable in the things that I make. And those are the skills that I focus on. Because if I was trying to do a little bit of gilding, a little bit of wood carving, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, I'd never get good at any of those sort of things. Because we've got finite resources, hours in the day, finite mental capacity, and we have to try to use that to its maximum potential. And that's up to the individual, I believe, to figure out what they want to do and what they're slightly more naturally inclined towards and talented at, and exploit those areas the most. And not to be afraid to reach out to others who are better than you in certain areas and collaborate with them. I mean, like my workbench, I haven't got a lathe, so I've got no problems in saying, hey, Frank, can you turn me up the blank for this or something like that? Or if I wanted a tool handle or something made, I'd just ask him to, like, I've got no hesitations at all, because I realize, time is usually the limiting factor. And if you want to have a good work-life balance, it's something you really have to consider. Yeah.
Oh, no,
sorry about the long-winded answer.
No, not at all. No, that's fine. That really sort of rings true with me, because I unfortunately don't practice things. I think I haven't got enough time. I can't waste the time doing a practice thing, and of course it's not time wasted. So, I've probably be lucky if I've done 100 dovetails in my lifetime, which is really bad. And I'm trying to do something just now with sort of through dovetails, and I'm butchering them. Each one's better than the one before, but none of them are really good. And it is a problem. I need to sort of stop and take the time to practice and get the skill up, because I've got the basic understanding of what I should be doing, and I've done some, and some of them have been fine, but it's very variable, and I need to get that consistency. And then once I've got that, I can work on the speed, and it'll all begin to come together. But so one day soon, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that mentality for me only also came about through my engineering work. See, I started off with a very hands-on approach, in a more of a technical. I went to a polytechnic, I guess you could call it, what we call a TAFE here. When I first started with that fabrication sort of a thing in 2007 to 2010, that era, that period of time. And then I did my degree as a mature age student in 2012 to 2016, just to get that piece of paper. But one of the things that I learned in engineering and working across all those industries, from mining, oil and gas, electrical transmissions, power transmissions and electrical generation, and now, working in defense and rail, it's impossible for one person to do everything. I work now as what they call a systems engineer, which generally in its purest sense is helping specialist engineers integrate their ideas and their interfaces, where their components that they come up with all meet, and make sure that they work as seamlessly as possible. It's so important. And in my head, that's really trained me to realize that it's impossible for one man to be able to weld, cut dovetails, carve, whatever. It might be possible for the one in a billion, but for the everyday man, especially for a hobbyman, it's impossible. It just will never happen. So it's important, I believe, for people to understand where their strengths lie and where their weaknesses lie, and then to really play to that, and to have no shame, and not think anyone would ever think of them any less by approaching an expert in another area where you are not so good.
Very much. I mean, I started off as a metallurgist, and I've got a little bit of qualification in that, but the factory that I was working for closed down before I got fully qualified. So I ended up taking a completely different career path. And I never got back to the metallurgy, but it was interesting. And in part of that, I learned how to weld, so I can do sort of functional welding, but I didn't do enough of it to become good at it. And, probably never will, because I don't really need it a lot. But I'm now trying to become good at woodworking, so I need to put more of an effort into the practicing, I think, and get in there. But no, thanks for. I've been hogging your time, so I'll let somebody else get a word in. But it's been fantastic, Siggy. Thanks very much indeed. A privilege, and you'll need to come back and do more. We could have a Siggy season, I think. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think just for the sake of time, we're going to bring this to a close. I think this has got to be one of the longest talks that we've had on Bench Talk. And I don't think there's, I would have stopped it earlier if I felt it was needed. But it's been a brilliant talk. Thank you very much, Siggy. And in Bench Talk tradition, I think we'll all raise a glass. You can raise your coffee mug with VB in it. And cheers, Siggy, and cheers to the bench.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.